Hi again, and welcome back to our Learn to Code by Writing Space Invaders course. In our last lesson, we actually worked out how to get our bullets to hit aliens and kill them. But at the moment, the aliens are simply disappearing off the screen. So in this lesson, we're going to look at creating some explosion effects. And we're going to do that using something which I'm going to term dynamic arrays. But let's hear more about that once we get into our code. So let's start in our normal way by loading in our lesson 18 code and straight away saving that as lesson 19. And then if we hit Control R, we get to our game and we can see that we have our ship at the bottom and our aliens moving around, and again we've got that thing where we can shoot them but they just disappear. But what we want to do now is when we actually hit an alien, we want to have an explosion take place to signify that the alien has been killed. So we need to think about how we're going to implement that in our code. So far, we've been using arrays made from our Lua tables to store both our aliens and our bullets. And when we create those arrays, we simply create an element in the array for each of the either alien or bullet that we want to store. As we've seen now, when we shoot an alien, all we're simply doing is marking that alien's object as being dead using our alive flag. But we still leave that object sitting in the array. For our explosions, we're going to do it a slightly different way. We're going to use arrays again to store each of the individual explosions. But when we start the game, obviously we're going to start with no explosions. As soon as we hit an alien, then we need to add an explosion into our explosions array. And that will then go off and do some sort of animation. But now as we hit more aliens, we're going to fill up our explosions array. But as each of these explosions then finishes, so there'll be a short animation and then it will finish, we don't need them to stay in the array anymore. So we can simply take them out of the array. So instead of leaving them sitting in there, taking up space, we're going to take out an explosion element as soon as it's finished. As more aliens are killed, we can simply add more explosions into our array. And then once they finish, we can remove them from that as well. This means that our explosions array will only ever contain active explosions. So let's look at how we're going to code this then. If we come into our TIC80 software, we can scroll down here and we've seen here that we've been setting up all of our alien arrays and so on. So we're obviously going to need an explosions array. So let's create our variable explosions and set that equal to an empty table, so we can then start to fill it up with our actual explosions. We then need to find where the alien is actually hit by the bullet, and that's in our check bullet collisions function. So if we go down to that and have a look through, we'll see that we are checking each individual player bullet, and then we are doing each individual alien. And at a point down here, we will find, at this point, this is where the bullet or a bullet has hit an alien and killed it. So this is the point where we actually then need to create our explosion. So let me drop into our smaller font size here and we'll see how we're going to do this. So we've got our alien being marked as dead. We've got our player bullet then being marked as having hit, and it needs then to be reset. So at this point we actually need to create an explosion. So let's call a function. So again we're gonna handle our explosion in its own special function to keep all that bit of code separate then. So let's do an alien explosion. Now, our alien explosion is going to need to have some information telling it where the explosion is on the screen. So we know that the alien that's just been hit is given by this expression here. So our aliens array in a particular row and column. And we know that that alien then has a current position. And this position obviously then is where the explosion needs to be. So let's just simply pass that information through to our explosions function. So if I copy that and paste it in here, and we know that we have a position object inside our alien object, and that will give the x and y coordinates of where this particular alien happens to be, and obviously that's then where our explosion needs to take place. So we now need to create our function, so our alien explosion function, and we know that it will accept a position object which will contain the x and y coordinates, and that's all we need then to set this going. So let's create this explosions function then. So I'm going to copy the name here so I don't forget what it is, and we're going to go down to the bottom of our code, and we're going to create our function explosions, and we know that that's going to receive the explosion position. So let's receive that in a variable called explosion position. Let me just make sure that's an n, and then of course we need to end our function there. Okay. So in our function then, we're going to need to add an explosion object into our explosions array. So let's first of all create that object. So this is going to be an object which we're going to create in this function. So I'm going to create it as a local variable, and this is going to be an explosion. And it's going to be one of our Lua tables, which we're going to use then as an explosion object. And we're going to work out what's going to go inside that in a second. But once we create our object, we're going to want to put that into our explosions array. And this is something we haven't done yet, at least not in this particular way. There's a special set of functions inside Lua which lets us handle our tables. And we can say use one of the table functions, and the function which allows us to insert something into a table, and then we simply have to tell it which table we want to insert into. So we're going to insert something into our explosions table, and the thing we want to insert is this new explosion object. So this will actually then add an explosion into the array. And that's what we're doing here. Okay? So what will happen now, when our alien is hit, this function will be called, and it will be given the position where the alien was hit at. We're then going to create this explosion object, and we're then going to insert that into our explosions array. So that will create a new explosion object in our explosions table. So let's have a think about what needs to go inside this explosion object then. So it stands to reason that we're going to have a position. So it's going to have to know where on the screen it's going to be. And let's actually spell that correctly. And that position then is actually going to be the same. Position. Okay, it's actually going to be the position that we just passed in. So remember, this contains an x and a y coordinates inside one object. So let's create, same as we've done for both our bullets and player ship and our aliens, create a position object within our explosion object, which will have our x and y coordinates. So we can simply do that, and that will get everything set up. And again, this shows another example of the power of using objects and using sub-objects, is that we can start passing whole little blocks of data around and inserting them into different areas by simply doing this expression. So we know that's going to have our position there. And for now, let's just leave it at that to see if we can get this actually drawing on the screen. So we've got an explosion, and we know what position it's in. So we know that at some point we're going to have to draw these explosions. So let's create our draw function. So let's create a function which is going to be draw explosions. And that's simply then going to So end, and that will be our end of our draw explosions. Okay. So inside this then, all we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of our explosions and simply draw them on the screen. Now for the moment we don't have anything to draw yet, so let's go off and make sure that we have an explosion sprite. Okay, so I'm going to put it down here. We're going to do a very similar thing eventually to what we've done here, where we're going to have a number of sprites one after the other, which are going to be the different frames in our explosion animation. But for now, I'm going to just simply put in a single frame, and for me, I'm just going to put it in here, and I'm going to then expand out here with the frames of this animation. But I'm going to draw the first one for now, and for me, that's going to be in sprite position 64. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to do some random explosion colored dots all over the place and put these in here. So just trying to just fill up the thing with explosion style colors. Probably do a bit more red in here, and that's all we need to do. And let's do a couple more yellow over here. And a bit more orange in this last bits. And there we have an explosion taking place. Oh, not green, red, sorry. In our frame. So we want to draw sprite number 64 where our explosion is taking place. So let's go back to our code. So over here, we now need to find a way of going through each of our explosions and drawing them out. Now previously we knew exactly how many elements were in our arrays, so we could do a for loop which would simply count up from 1 to the number of elements we had. But this time we don't actually know how many elements we have. So we're going to use a special version of the for loop. In Lua, this is called a for in loop, and in some languages it's called a for each loop. But if I type the line in first, so we're going to say for, and then we're going to create 2 variables. Okay, so we're going to have an index and an actual explosion, and then we're going to tell it which array we want to work with. And we use a special iPairs function on our explosions array. And let's type it in correctly. Okay. So what this is saying is it's saying take every element in our explosions array and split it up into 2 variables. One variable is going to tell us what the index of this current explosion is, and the second variable is going to give us the actual explosion object. So remember, our explosions array is just simply a collection of all of our current explosions that are active in the system. So the iPairs function, along with this for loop, will split it up, and that will tell us what the index value is, so we can actually reference our explosion. And this will then be given the value of the current explosion object. Okay? So again, if you're doing other languages, this is called a for each loop. So let's come down here and let's say that's the end of our for loop. And what we want to do then is we want to simply print a sprite at the position of this particular explosion. So I'm going to say put a sprite, and remember our sprite number, which I've instantly forgotten, is sprite number 64. So put sprite 64 at our explosion.position.x and our explosion.position.y. Okay, so remember, explosion is the object we're currently working with, which has been taken out of our explosions array using this function here. So if we do that, hopefully that will draw a little explosion sprite for each of the explosions that are currently in our explosions array. And actually, let me just change that to the word explosion. So all we need to do now is to make sure that our draw explosions function is called as part of our main tick function. So let's jump back up to our tick function. And inside here we can see that we're doing all of our drawing. So we draw our bullets, our ship and our aliens. So after that we then need to draw our explosions. So hopefully if we run this we should then be able, so Control R to run it, we should be able to now get some explosions appearing on the screen. And you can see there we have our explosions coming in and our aliens being hit. So again, we currently have our explosion sprite being drawn on there, and we haven't yet done any animating of the explosion or doing any timing functions on the explosion to make it disappear after a certain amount of animation. So let's have a work on that now. So back into our code, and let's go back down to our explosions area, so draw explosions. Okay, so at the moment then, all we're simply doing is when an alien is hit, we're creating this explosion variable or explosion object, and all we're giving it is a position. What we need to do now is we need to have some sort of timer which will let us have this explosion on screen for a certain amount of time, and then after that timer's run out, it will then disappear off. So let's come in here and let's create a new variable inside our object, and we're going to get that to count how many ticks it has been since the explosion started. So how many times our tick function has been called. So let's do that in a tick counter variable. And when we first start our explosion, we want that to be set to 0. We then want to say how long our tick counter needs to count for. So we're going to say our total number of ticks that our explosion will carry on for. And let's set that to, let's set it to 30 at the moment, because that's half a second. And let's see how that works out. So when we create our explosion, we give it a position. We say we're going to run for 30 ticks, and we haven't yet counted any ticks yet. So if we now come down to our draw explosions function, and we know that this draw explosions function is part of our, it's called in our tick function, so it's called every time we go through that tick process. So if we come in here, we know that then this loop will go through every single active explosion. So at this point when we're inside the loop, we are now talking to one of the currently active explosions. So since this function is called every tick, we can simply update our explosion tick counter. So if we do our explosion.tick counter, and we're going to just simply add 1 to it. So we're going to increment it. Explosion.tick counter plus 1. Okay, so that now tells us how many ticks this particular explosion has been running for. We know then from up here we set a value of total ticks, so we told it that this explosion needs to run for 30. So we now need to check if it's finished. So if our explosion.tick counter is greater than our explosion total ticks, then this explosion has finished. And let's end our if statement there. When our explosion finishes, previously as we've said, in our aliens array and so on, we've just marked it as being dead and left it sitting there. But this time we're actually going to physically take it out of the array. So just like we saw above here where we could insert objects into our table or into our array, we have a special function called table.remove, which allows us to remove objects from our tables. Okay, so take it out of our array. And the way this works is we tell it which array we want to remove an object from, and we then have to give it the index of that object. So remember when we did this for in loop, or the for each loop if you want to call it that, we use this special iPairs function to take the next element from our explosions array and give us two variables, one which identified the index and one which was the actual object. Okay, so this process of going through each of the elements of this array one by one is called iteration. So as we iterate through our array, we are taking out these two values, and that then becomes very handy down here. So we can say, let's remove from the table the element with the index marked by this variable. So our explosion counter gets updated every tick. And if it gets past our final value, so our total tick's 30, so half a second, it should then be removed from our table. And then the next time we come through our draw explosions array, this explosion will no longer exist, so it won't get drawn. So let's see if that works. We're doing Control R, and we're going to run it. Oh, so we have an error here. So let's see, we expect it to close at line 437. So let's come back into our code. So line 437. So Sprite, and yes, I forgot to put my end bracket in there. Okay. So we have our thing now. So let's see if that runs. So coming over here, let's see if we can shoot an alien. And there we go, and we can now see that our explosions last for about half a second. Okay, and back into our code. So we've got all the bare bones now for our explosions. So we can create the explosion, we can add it into our explosions array, we can then draw all of our current explosions by using this iteration loop, which will go through each of the active ones. And then once our explosion has run its time, we can take it out of the array so it no longer exists, and our array is just kept nice and clean with just our active explosions in it. Last thing we need to do now is to animate that little sprite. So let's go into our Sprite Editor. So again, we've seen that animation, we simply need to draw a number of frames. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to do 4 frames in my animation. So I'm simply going to create 4 little explosion sprites, doing it exactly the same way as I did there, and I'm then going to animate these. So you can do the same if you want. If you want to do another 4 or however many you want to do, it's up to you. But as long as they come one after the other, so check the sprite number. So mine starts at 64, so I need to put my next one 65, 66, 67, and so on. So I'm going to come back once I've put those in. So I've now got my 4 animation frames, starting at sprite number 64, 65, 66, and number 67. So let's go back into our code. So again, when we create our explosion, I'm going to tell my system I want to give it a base sprite number so that we don't have to type in that number 64 all the time. But I'm going to say it's going to be a base sprite of number 64. And we're going to say that the number of frames in our animation is going to be 4 frames. So we have our code ready there. So down here, we just need to make sure that our sprite function picks out the right sprite. So let's come in here and let's do some code above here. So we know that we want to use this number here with an actual calculated value. So let's create a local variable up here to hold that. So local sprite number, and that's going to then be used by our code here. So we're going to say then that our sprite number, so sprite number number is going to be equal to, and this is where we have to now work out our function to actually calculate this number. So we know that we have a tick counter here, which is going to count from 0 up to our total ticks value. So we can use that to do part of our calculation. So if we take our tick counter, and let's put this inside brackets. So our tick counter, we saw a function before called our modulus function. And what that will do, that will divide a number by another number and give us the remainder of the division. So if we have our tick counter counting up, and if we divide that by our explosion.num frames, what this will actually end up doing, it will give us a count from 0 up to 1 under num frames. So our num frames at the moment is set to 4. Yep. So when explosion tick counter is 0, so 0 divided by 4 is 0, remainder 0. So remember, our modulus function gives us the remainder, so that will be 0. When tick counter is 1, we get 0, remainder 1, so we get a 1. 2, the remainder will be 2. 3, the remainder will be 3. Okay, so that will give us our 0, 1, 2, 3. When tick counter then goes to 4, our modulus function, so our division will give us 1, remainder 0. So we actually go back to 0 again. 5 will then give us 1, remainder 1, so we'll get back to 1. 6 will give us remainder 2, 7 remainder 3, and then 8 will go back to 0 again. So you can see that using this modulus function and using our number of frames to do the division, we will get a counter which will go from 0 up to 1 less than num frames. So if we simply add that onto our base sprite number, so if I come in here, and if I come after that, take a new line, move that across here, so plus explosion.base sprite, you can see that that will give us our 64, 65, 66 and 67, and then back to 64 again. Then all I need to do is I need to make sure that when we draw the sprite, instead of doing the 64, we use our sprite number. Okay, so hopefully that should now be our explosion routine finished. So let's see if that works. So I'm going to do a Control R, and we will shoot some aliens, and there we have our explosion taking place and our aliens being killed. Okay, so let's come out of that. That's now finished our explosion code. So we've seen that we have come in here. So when an alien's hit, we create an explosion object, we fill it with all the correct information, and we then insert it into our explosions table, our explosions array as well. When we draw our explosions, we can use this special type of for loop to iterate through all of the elements in our explosions array. We can use this modulus function to help us get through each of our animation frames. And then we've used this counter function to tell us how long the explosion has been running for. And when the explosion has finished with this test here, we can then physically remove it from our explosions array by using this table remove thing. And again, because we've used this special iteration loop, it will tell us which index we're working with, so we can tell the function exactly which element to remove. Okay, so that's the explosions finished. So let's make sure we save our work. And I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. See you soon. Don't forget to visit the course pages for this project. There you'll be able to download the code for this lesson and get lots of extra hints and tips. You'll also get access to all my other programming, electronics and gaming projects. All the links are in the description below. For more games programming, electronics projects and retro gaming, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and visit my website.